In the quiet neighborhoods of Wichita, Kansas, and the surrounding communities, the ordinary rhythm of daily life masked a nightmare lurking just beneath the surface, a nightmare that would shatter the sense of safety for decades. Dennis Rader, a man who by all appearances was an upstanding citizen, devoted family man, and pillar of his community, harbored a dark and terrifying secret. Behind his friendly smile as a church council president, a Cub Scout leader, and a compliant city worker, he lived a secret life as the BTK killer, a monstrous predator who would bind, torture, and kill at least 10 victims over nearly 2 decades. This chilling duality is almost impossible to comprehend, the capacity for evil to hide behind the most mundane facades. Rader did not fit the profile of a shadowy loner or a social outcast. In fact, his normalcy was his greatest camouflage. His neighbors saw a polite, reliable man who attended church regularly, participated in community activities, and seemed wholly unremarkable. Yet this ordinary veneer concealed a meticulously calculated persona, crafted to exert control and terrorize on an unfathomable scale. The name BTK itself was no accidental label. Dennis Rader deliberately created this moniker, bind, torture, kill, not just as a descriptor of his heinous methods, but as a terrifying brand. It was an emblem of his identity, a signature he weaponized in chilling taunts sent to law enforcement and media outlets. Through letters, packages, and cryptic messages, he reveled in the power to instill fear, manipulating public perception and asserting control from the shadows. This was terror as psychological warfare, extending beyond the immediate horror of his crimes to poison the collective peace of an entire community. While living this deceptive double life, Rader maintained roles that showcased his positioning within the social fabric. As a church council president, he was trusted and respected. As a scout leader, he was a mentor to children. These trusted positions paradoxically enabled his crimes. By fostering the illusion of safety, he kept suspicion at bay. His outward life was the very embodiment of normalcy, enabling him to evade detection while planning and executing horrific acts in secrecy. This juxtaposition of the benign and the brutal evokes profound questions about the nature of evil and the terrifying possibility that true danger sometimes wears a human mask. Rader's normal life extended to family as well, a husband and father who lived with his wife and children, embodying the American dream of suburban stability. Yet within this domestic setting, a darker reality festered. His family life was just another layer of his elaborate facade, hiding the twisted urges and sadistic compulsions that drove him. It was a paradox of benign familiarity and vicious malevolence coexisting in the same man, baffling those who knew him and confounding investigators for years. The BTK persona was more than a mere label. It represented Rader's need to control the narrative and elevate his ego. He sought not only the gratification derived from the brutality itself, but also the infamy that came with it. His communications were calculated performances, designed to taunt police and the media, to broadcast his identity on his own terms. This self-styled identity symbolizes an extreme form of narcissism, a dangerous need for recognition that positioned him not just as a killer, but as a figure of fear and fascination. This dual existence raises profound psychological tensions. How can such brutal evil hide behind the guise of the ordinary? What allows a man to wear a mask of civility while committing unfathomable acts? The BTK case forces us to confront unsettling truths about human nature, that masculinity, family roles, and community involvement can coexist with horrific darkness. It challenges us to question our assumptions about where evil lives and how well we can truly know those closest to us. As we peel back the layers of Dennis Rader's life, this section sets the stage for a deeper exploration of the horrific crimes that lay beneath the surface, the twisted psyche that drove him, and the haunting legacy he left behind. The story of the masked monster reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying shadows are found not lurking in the night, but hidden in plain sight. The story of the BTK killer is one of chilling method and merciless calculation. At the heart of Dennis Rader's brutal legacy is a ragged trail of violence and terror that left at least 10 confirmed victims dead, their lives forever stolen in anonymous nightmares that unfolded behind closed doors in Wichita and Park City, Kansas. To understand the full horror of his crimes, we must peer into the cold, deliberate rituals that defined how he hunted, subdued, and ultimately destroyed those in his grasp. From his earliest attack in 1974 to his final known murder in 1991, Rader's modus operandi revealed a disturbing blend of violent force and manipulative cunning. His victims were mostly women, often taken from the intimate confines of their own homes where they felt safest. But safety was an illusion. He shattered it with careful, premeditated tactics designed to isolate and immobilize. In some cases, he would stalk his victims for days or even weeks, learning their routines and habits to strike when they were most vulnerable. In others, he disabled phone lines, severing any chance a victim might have had to call for help, effectively cutting them off from the outside world during their final moments. Rader's entry methods evolved over time. Early on, he would force his way in, gun in hand, like with the Otero family. Later, he grew more sophisticated. He posed as a detective during one attack, as a telephone repairman during another, roles that let him move inside homes without immediate suspicion. In a particularly harrowing instance, after gaining entry, he concealed himself in a closet, waiting to ambush his victim. Each variation was a careful experiment in control, a deadly rehearsal in terror. This steady refinement was no accident, but a reflection of his calculating mind, always seeking dominance and minimizing risk to himself while maximizing his victim's powerlessness. Once inside, Rader's victims faced the sadistic ritual that defined his moniker: bind, torture, kill. Items from the victim's own homes, a rope from a closet, a scarf from a dresser, stockings from a drawer, were twisted into instruments of captivity. Sometimes he came prepared with his own restraints, including ropes, handcuffs, and bandanas, each chosen to enforce a terrifying degree of physical and psychological control. The bindings were not just a means of subduing, but part of an elaborate ritual that stripped each victim of autonomy and dignity. Through the tight constriction of these restraints, Rader asserted dominance, breaking spirits before breaking bodies. The methods of murder were just as brutal and merciless as the bindings. Suffocation was frequent, plastic bags pressed tightly over faces to smother breath. Ligatures such as ropes, belts, and nylon stockings were tightened around necks in manual strangulation. In a particularly haunting example from his very first known attack, Josephine Otero was hanged in the basement. Catherine Bright's death was marked by both stabbing and strangulation, a convergence of pain and prolonged terror. Each victim died in the grip of suffocating fear, the final moments a grotesque extension of the control Rader wielded over them. But Rader's cruelty extended beyond the immediate physical torment. He kidnapped keepsakes, underwear, driver's licenses, and other personal items, transforming them into macabre trophies. These objects were not merely souvenirs. They were keys in his dark compulsions, tools that enabled him to relive and fetishize his crimes in graphic detail. Between murders, Rader engaged in elaborate autoerotic rituals. He wore stolen clothing, tied himself up, even posed as his victims, twisted reenactments that fed his fantasies and sustained his depraved cycle. These acts were foreplay to his next attack, a psychological build-up that blurred the lines between reality and nightmare. His cooling-off periods were never real breaks, but charged interludes where fantasy and obsession flared in tandem. Each victim's story speaks not only of physical terror, but also of deep human loss. Joseph Otero, Julia Maria, their children Joseph Jr. and Josephine, 4 lives annihilated in an unthinkable home invasion. Nancy Fox, a young woman held at gunpoint and forced into suffocation, forever marked in Rader's mind as the object of his twisted need for photographic evidence and control, even beyond death. Vicky Vegerle, kidnapped under false pretenses, murdered in a manner consistent with his ritual bindings and strangulation signature, a victim whose fingernail DNA would one day become the key to his capture. Each face, etched in tragedy, reminds us that behind the brutal coldness of the crimes were living people, embodying hopes, fears, and the sheer vulnerability of existence. Beyond the physical bindings lay a sinister psychological stranglehold. Rader's crimes were exercises in absolute domination, stripping away not just life, but the agency, the dignity, the very identity of those he targeted. The binding of the body was inseparable from the breaking of the spirit. He imposed a meticulously choreographed terror, enforcing submission through fear and physical restraint, reiterating his power at every stage of the attack. His victims were trapped in spaces where flight was impossible, breath was stolen, and time dragged agonizingly toward the inevitable. This methodical and ritualistic pattern reflected the pathology of a man who saw himself not simply as a killer, but as an orchestrator of fear and control, an architect of pain and silence. The evolving complexity of his tactics, from disabling phones to impersonating officials, from direct violent confrontations to deceitful entry, illustrates a predator learning and adapting, ever sharpened by experience and fueled by the compulsive need to dominate. The vicious choreography of BTK's murders was never random. Each act, each struggle, etched another line in the signature of terror he left behind. Yet through all this, these stories serve a vital purpose: to humanize the lives lost beneath the hammer of BTK's brutality. They are testimonies to the profound horror those victims endured, but also reminders that they were individuals, mothers, fathers, children, neighbors, not mere shadows or statistics. In remembering their names, their faces, and the violent cost of Rader's calculated cruelty, we break the silence he so desperately sought to impose. This grim tapestry of binding and breaking, of terror meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed, marks the core of the BTK legacy. It is a story of control wielded with savage precision, of lives undone in the privacy of homes that became arenas of horror. It is a call to bear witness, to never let the memories of these individuals fade into silence or obscurity. As we move forward, this understanding of BTK's method, the dark mechanics of his violence and the human tragedy entwined within, sets the stage for what comes next. The relentless pursuit of justice, the painstaking unraveling of his enigma, and the eventual reckoning brought about by a new era of forensic science. But for now, we hold close the stories of those who were bound and broken, ensuring that their lives, and the terror they endured, are never forgotten. For decades, the city of Wichita lived under the shadow of an elusive monster who named himself BTK, bind, torture, kill, a chilling brand that encapsulated his brutal method and sinister need for control. But what finally ended the reign of terror was not brute force or eyewitness testimony. It was a digital reckoning born of the killer's own arrogance. This is the story of how Dennis Rader's overwhelming narcissism led to his capture through a fatal misstep involving modern technology. From the very start, BTK engaged in a twisted game of cat and mouse with law enforcement. His communication was relentless, a psychological warfare in which the killer toyed with police and terrified the public. Decades of silence followed his last confirmed murder in 1991, allowing the case to grow cold and the fear to persist as a haunting mystery. But then, in 2004, the killer re-emerged, not with violence but with taunts over the media and letters sent to authorities. It was a calculated gamble to reclaim the spotlight, driven not by a fresh desire to kill, but by a profound narcissistic hunger for recognition and infamy. After more than a decade in the shadows, BTK could not resist the need to regain control of the narrative. Spurred on by a new book about the case, he began sending messages to local newspapers and television stations, punctuated with detailed descriptions of crimes only the original perpetrator could know. These communications also included chilling keepsakes from victims and disturbing drawings, each a psychological weapon aimed at provoking terror and ensuring the city and the police never forgot him. It was a cruel reminder that the wounds of his reign extended far beyond the physical, inflicting pain and re-traumatization upon victims' families and the wider community. The ultimate turning point came with a seemingly innocuous device, a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk sent to a local TV station in early 2005. Rader's confidence blinded him to the advances in forensic science that had taken place since his first crime. He believed the digital message on the disk would remain anonymous, immune to tracing or identification. But forensic experts knew otherwise. When investigators examined the disk, they discovered it contained hidden metadata, a digital signature embedded within a deleted Word document. This metadata revealed the words Christ Lutheran Church alongside a username, Dennis. This was no anonymous taunt. It was a crucial breadcrumb linking the disk to a real-world person and place. Christ Lutheran Church had a council president named Dennis Rader. This breakthrough illuminated the critical role of modern digital forensics, a tool that was unavailable during the original investigations. Beyond the metadata, law enforcement cross-referenced other evidence. Surveillance footage showed a vehicle matching Rader's black Jeep Cherokee near drop-off points, and DNA recovered from the fingernails of a victim finally found a match through familial DNA testing, a match to Rader's daughter's genetic profile. The convergence of these threads, all new forensic methodologies, unraveled what had been a decades-old mystery. The irony is stark. The man who once proclaimed himself a master manipulator, evading capture through a facade of normalcy and careful planning, fell victim to his own hubris and technological naivety. In his own words, captured during interrogation, Rader famously acknowledged, "The floppy did me in." That simple statement encapsulates the moment where his reign of terror met its match, not in a dramatic standoff, but through invisible digital footprints no less damning than fingerprints or eyewitness testimony. This case stands as a landmark in the evolution of forensic science and criminal investigation. It highlights how the digital age can finally shine a light into the darkest corners of human evil, tracing the faintest signals left behind in a web of data. But it also raises profound questions about privacy, surveillance, and the expanding reach of law enforcement into the lives of innocent family members whose genetic information can implicate suspects through familial searching methods. Dennis Rader's capture was not just the end of a reign of terror, it was a profound demonstration of how tenacity, evolving technology, and the terror of a killer's own ego converged to bring justice decades after the first horrifying act. The digital key cracked the silence that had lingered for years, exposing the man behind the mask of BTK and ending a chapter of unimaginable horror for the people of Wichita. As we reflect on this digital reckoning, it becomes clear that in the battle against darkness, new tools and technologies hold immense power. But the hubris of those who think themselves untouchable, who crave attention and recognition even at great risk, remains one of the greatest vulnerabilities to be exploited. This intersection of human psychology and forensic science brings a chilling yet hopeful lesson. Even the most cunning evil leaves behind traces that can and will lead to the truth. In trying to understand Dennis Rader, the man behind the BTK legend, we must confront a chilling truth. The darkness within his mind reveals not just horrific acts, but a complex psychological landscape marked by deep-rooted wounds, twisted compulsions, and an insatiable hunger for control and recognition. To peer inside his psyche is to face the disturbing interplay of childhood humiliation, violent fantasies, and an extreme narcissism that propelled decades of calculated terror. Dennis Rader's childhood laid the groundwork for what would become a deadly pathology. He was not merely born evil, rather, a potent mix of shame and humiliation shaped his early experiences. Central to this was the role of his mother, whose shaming behavior deeply affected him, creating a psychological terrain steeped in anger and helplessness, particularly in his relationships with women. This shame didn't dissipate with age, but festered, fueling violent sexual fantasies that intertwined bondage, torture, and a compulsive need to dominate. These were not fleeting thoughts. They were vivid, persistent mental images Rader described as a picture show he felt compelled to direct and enact. From a young age, he imagined girl traps, ways to bind and control women, a direct precursor to the real-life horrors he would inflict. These fantasies were as much a desperate exercise in reclaiming power as they were expressions of sadistic desire. What emerges from this is a man whose criminal acts were more than physical violence. They were ritualistic reenactments of his internal struggle. Between murders, Rader engaged in complex and disturbing rituals. He would revisit his crimes through stolen trophies like victims' underwear or personal belongings, which he used to fuel autoerotic fantasies. He took photographs of himself, donning women's clothing and masks, binding and torturing himself in simulated reenactments. These acts were not signs of remorse, but manifestations of his unyielding compulsion, a grotesque form of foreplay for his next victim, as he described it. Rather than cooling off, these periods were intense psychological engagements, allowing him to sustain and escalate his depravity over nearly 2 decades. At the core of Rader's psyche was a toxic need for control and recognition. His communications with police and media were laced with ego and a desire to be feared and remembered. He openly admitted to craving publicity, questioning, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national recognition?" His self-branding as BTK, the acronym for bind, torture, kill, was more than a confession. It was a declaration of identity. He rejected the label serial killer, instead seeing himself as something akin to a terrorist, an agent of terror wielding control indiscriminately over men, women, and children. This grandiosity was emblematic of a profound narcissism, an egomania that thrived on the sustained fear and chaos he imposed. Even from prison, Rader sought to craft a legacy, cooperating with authors, maintaining relevance, and reveling in the spotlight, perpetuating his infamy. Psychologists studying Rader characterize him as an unconventional psychopath. Not the impulsive, disorganized killer, but a patient, coldly calculating predator with long-term plans and carefully maintained facades. His crimes were choreographed with methodical precision, and he successfully compartmentalized his life, maintaining steady employment, family roles, and community involvement, even as he committed unspeakable acts. His profound lack of empathy and remorse, except, notably, for being caught, highlighted the affective deficits typical of psychopathy. Yet, unlike some psychopaths, he displayed remarkable goal orientation, showing responsibility in daily life, which paradoxically masked his dark compulsions and allowed him to evade suspicion for decades. Rader's twisted obsession with control also extended to his victims' families and the larger Wichita community. The trauma inflicted goes far beyond the loss of life. Families of victims have described living set apart, ensnared in a nightmare they cannot escape. The killer's resurgence in the early 2000s, with taunting communications and renewed contact, re-traumatized those still seeking closure, reopening wounds thought to be healing. The community at large lived under a persistent shadow of fear for decades, a form of prolonged psychological terrorism. Serial killer events like this dramatically escalate and prolong societal fear, and the BTK case stands as a harrowing example of this enduring terror. Further complicating Rader's sinister legacy are revelations about abuses within his own family. In recent years, his daughter courageously revealed that he had sexually abused her during her childhood. This disclosure shatters any illusions of his normal family life and underscores the pervasive and hidden nature of his predation. This internal betrayal reveals that the darkness he cast outward was also deeply embedded in his closest relationships, adding layers of trauma and victimhood that extend beyond the public narrative. As new investigations continue into potential additional victims, and as the full extent of Rader's predatory reach slowly unfolds, we are reminded that the shadow cast by such individuals does not easily lift. It lingers in the lives damaged, in the community scarred, and in the collective consciousness grappling with the nature of evil. In reflecting on the mind of Dennis Rader, we confront uncomfortable questions about the roots of monstrosity, the fragile boundaries that separate normalcy from horror, and the resilience required to survive in the wake of such cruelty. His story compels us to remember that beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary life can lie a darkness capable of shattering countless lives. It challenges us to reckon with the ongoing impact on victims and communities, and to seek understanding, not to excuse but to illuminate the human cost and the complex forces that give rise to such enduring shadows.